Tomorrow morning, millions of people around the world will drive to work. Some will complain about traffic, some about long meetings, some about difficult customers. Almost all of them will expect to come home alive. Now imagine starting your workday by climbing onto a wooden platform pulled by 4 horses running at nearly 40 miles per hour. No seatbelt, no suspension, no brakes, no ambulance waiting nearby. And before the race even begins, you deliberately wrap the reins around your own waist. Because if you don't, you can't control the horses. But if the chariot crashes, those same reins become your death sentence. You're dragged across the ground, trampled by your own horses, or crushed beneath the wheels of the chariots racing behind you, unless you can pull a small knife from your belt and cut yourself free in less than a second. Most people think the most dangerous celebrities in ancient Rome were gladiators. Hollywood certainly does, but history tells a very different story. The deadliest profession in the Roman world wasn't inside the Colosseum. It was inside a racetrack, so enormous that modern sports stadiums still struggle to match its scale. The Circus Maximus and the men who entered it weren't simply athletes. They were the Formula One drivers, rock stars, and billionaires of the ancient world. The question is, why would anyone willingly risk one of the most horrifying deaths imaginable just to drive a chariot? The answer reveals one of the strangest economies ever created. Because for the few who survived, the rewards were almost beyond imagination. One Roman driver retired with a fortune that modern historians estimate would equal billions of dollars today. Not millions, billions. So how did an ordinary chariot driver become richer than emperors, while thousands of others died before they were 30? To understand that, you first have to understand why an entire empire became obsessed with a sport far more dangerous than anything we watch today. The Circus Maximus wasn't just another arena. At its peak, it was the largest sports stadium the ancient world had ever built. Hundreds of thousands of spectators packed its enormous grandstands. Emperors watched from private boxes. Senators filled the best seats. Ordinary citizens crowded everywhere else. For a few hours, the entire city gathered around one obsession: the race. Forget everything Hollywood taught you about gladiators. Gladiatorial games were spectacular, but they weren't Rome's favorite sport. Chariot racing was. The greatest drivers became household names across the empire. Children knew their victories by heart. Fans argued endlessly over who was the greatest. People painted team colors on their homes, placed enormous bets, started fights, even riots. Long before football clubs or Formula One teams existed, Rome already had 4 legendary factions: the Blues, the Greens, the Reds, and the Whites. You didn't simply watch a race, you belonged to a team. Some supporters remained loyal to the same colors for their entire lives. Others spent fortunes betting on their favorite driver. Winning races brought glory. Losing could destroy careers overnight. But the greatest danger wasn't losing. It was surviving the next corner. Unlike modern racetracks, the Circus Maximus featured long, straight sections followed by incredibly tight turns around massive stone markers called the medae. Every driver wanted the shortest possible line. The closer you passed to the marker, the less distance you traveled. But getting just a few inches too close meant smashing a wheel against solid stone at full speed. One mistake, one frightened horse, one broken axle, and the entire race exploded into chaos. Romans even had a name for these catastrophic crashes: naufragium, shipwreck. Not because anyone was near the sea, because watching dozens of shattered chariots, overturned horses, broken wheels, and flying bodies looked like the wreckage of a sinking fleet. Imagine 12 chariots charging toward the same corner. 48 horses fighting for position, drivers pulling on the reins with every ounce of strength they had, the crowd screaming, dust filling the air. Then, one wheel clips the turning post, the chariot flips, horses panic. The driver hits the ground. And that's when the real nightmare begins. He isn't thrown clear. He's still tied to the horses. Every professional charioteer wrapped the reins around his waist. It wasn't recklessness. It was necessity. 4 powerful horses couldn't be controlled with arm strength alone. By anchoring the reins around the body, drivers could use their entire weight to guide the team through high-speed turns. It made them faster. It also made them prisoners of their own chariot. If the horses kept running after a crash, the driver went with them, across stone, across sand, beneath pounding hooves, until either the reins snapped or his body did. That's why every charioteer carried one small object that mattered more than anything else. Not a trophy, not extra money, a knife. a curved blade kept within easy reach at all times. Because after a crash, every fraction of a second mattered. If you reached the knife in time, you might cut yourself free. If you hesitated, the race didn't stop. The horses behind you kept coming. Death wasn't rare. It was expected. Ancient writers described crashes so violent that horses, chariots, and drivers became impossible to separate. Broken wheels flew into the air. Splintered wood scattered across the track. Bodies rolled beneath charging hooves. Spectators didn't look away. They leaned forward. Because every race balanced on the edge between victory and catastrophe, and yet the starting gates continued to open. Again, and again, and again. So why would anyone choose a career with odds like that? Because no profession in the Roman world offered a greater reward. Winning didn't just make you successful, it made you famous. Imagine combining the popularity of a Formula One champion, the wealth of the world's highest-paid athlete, and the influence of a movie star. That's how Rome treated its greatest charioteers. Crowds shouted their names. Children copied them, poets wrote about them, fans painted graffiti celebrating their favorite drivers on city walls. People argued endlessly over who deserved to be called the greatest. Some supporters followed the blue faction with almost religious devotion. Others would defend the greens no matter how badly they performed. The teams became identities, long before modern sports created lifelong fans. Rome had already perfected the idea. Money poured into the sport from every direction. Spectators placed enormous bets. Sponsors backed successful teams. Victorious drivers earned prize money that most Romans could never dream of. And unlike many gladiators, who were often slaves or prisoners, successful charioteers could accumulate extraordinary personal wealth. No one proved that better than one man. His name was Gaius Appuleius Diocles. Today, almost nobody remembers him. But during the 2nd century AD, he may have been the richest athlete who ever lived. Diocles wasn't born into wealth. He began racing as a young man and spent 24 years competing in the circus. Over the course of his career, he entered more than 4,000 races. He won over 1,400 of them, an astonishing record in a sport where simply surviving another season was never guaranteed. By the time he retired, he had earned nearly 36 million sesterces in prize money. Historians have debated exactly what that would equal today. The numbers vary, depending on how you calculate ancient wealth, but many estimates place its economic value in the range of billions of modern dollars. Enough to support thousands of Roman families for years. Enough to make senators jealous, enough to transform a chariot driver into one of the wealthiest public figures of his age. Think about that for a moment. The deadliest career in ancient Rome was also one of the most profitable. Every race asked the same question. How much is your life worth, for most drivers? The answer arrived long before retirement. But perhaps the most surprising part of this story isn't how much money Diocles earned. It's that he wasn't unique. Rome produced dozens of celebrity charioteers whose names were recognized across the empire. Some raced for decades. Others died before they ever reached their greatest potential. Every time the starting gates opened, the odds were brutally simple. Most drivers wouldn't become legends. Most wouldn't become billionaires. Most wouldn't even become old. They would simply become another name remembered only by the people who watched them die. And yet the races never lacked volunteers. Because fame has always done something extraordinary to the human mind. It convinces ordinary people that they'll be the exception, that the next victory will belong to them, that the next corner will be different, that the crash always happens to someone else. In that sense, the Circus Maximus wasn't so different from professional sports today. Young athletes still dedicate their entire lives to reaching the top. They accept injuries, pressure, failure, public criticism, because the reward waiting at the very top seems worth every sacrifice. Roman charioteers simply played that game with much higher stakes. Today, losing a championship might cost an athlete millions of dollars. 2,000 years ago, losing a race could cost you your life. That's why comparing charioteers to gladiators is so misleading. Gladiators certainly fought brutal battles, but they didn't enter the arena expecting to die every time. In fact, gladiators represented an expensive investment. Training them took years, and owners had every financial reason to keep successful fighters alive whenever possible. Chariot races worked differently. The danger wasn't carefully controlled. It was built into the sport itself. Every race demanded impossible speeds, desperate overtakes, exhausted horses, and razor-thin margins for error. The crowd wasn't watching despite the danger. The danger was part of what they came to see. Imagine sitting among hundreds of thousands of spectators. The gates burst open. The horses explode forward. Dust rises into the air. The drivers disappear into the first corner. For a moment, you don't know whether you're about to witness history or a disaster. Sometimes, they were exactly the same thing. Maybe that's why Rome loved chariot racing so much. It wasn't just about speed. It wasn't just about victory. It was about watching human ambition collide with fate. Every driver believed he could control 4 powerful horses, defeat dozens of rivals, survive another race, and leave the circus richer than he entered it. Some did, most didn't. And every time the crowd erupted as the starting gates flew open, thousands of Romans were really cheering for something much older than sport. They were cheering for the dangerous idea that glory is always worth one more risk. Imagine explaining modern sports to a Roman. Multi-million-dollar contracts, luxury hotels, private jets, medical teams, carbon fiber helmets, airbags, safety barriers. He'd probably wonder why anyone called that dangerous, because in his world, the greatest athletes weren't protected from death. They raced alongside it, every single time the gates opened. The Circus Maximus didn't reward the strongest man, or the bravest. It rewarded the one who survived long enough to become a legend. Some drivers crossed the finish line to the roar of 200,000 people. Others never reached it at all, and the crowd came back the next day, knowing they might watch the same story happen again. Maybe that's the strangest part of ancient Rome. The empire's greatest sports heroes weren't remembered because they never fell. They were remembered because every victory came with the possibility that it would be their last. The richest athlete in Roman history didn't become a legend because he drove the fastest horses. He became a legend because he survived a game that killed the people racing beside him. And every time those starting gates burst open, Rome wasn't just watching a race. It was watching thousands of pounds of wood, iron, horses, and human ambition hurtling toward the same corner, to find out who would become immortal and who would never leave the track.